Joining us to discuss all this is Avi Melamed. He's a former Israeli intelligence official and senior official on Arab affairs. Good morning, Avi. How close are we to a full-scale war, in your view?
Good morning. Well, we are witnessing yet another, of course, tense moment in the context of this whole wide-scale eruption of violence in the region. Yet I'm not so sure that we are getting very, very close to that point. Following the attack on Hezbollah this week and the erosion of its military capacities, I don't think that neither of the sides, meaning Israel, Hezbollah, and Iran, has a real interest into being dragged into a wide-scale war. That said, we have to take into consideration that there could be a dynamic leading to such an escalation.
What's your sense of Iran's plans for this stage of the war or the conflict?
Iran's most strategic important proxy is the Hezbollah. And the Hezbollah for the Iranian has two major objectives. One is to secure the control of Hezbollah over Lebanon and secure Iran's control over having a base of the Mediterranean Sea. And the other thing is to Hezbollah is supposed to be some sort of like a deterrence card that Iranians hold in order to thwart any attempts to attack its strategic assets. So the bottom line is that the Iranians don't like to jeopardize their most strategic important proxy, and hence the reluctance of Iran and Hezbollah to be dragged into such a wider collision.
Yeah, Hezbollah is incredibly backed by Iran, and I just want to check with you at this point, though, what is Israel's long-term game plan for Iran's aggression?
Well, I think that this war indicates very clearly what Western leaders have for so long choosing not to adhere, and this is the challenge, the significant threat that Iran presents not only to Israel, but to the region and to the global world. Just reminding you, the Houthis, one of the major Iranian proxies, has been damaging now for almost a year the global trade by attacking ships at the Red Sea and the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. The bottom line of this whole thing is that we are looking at a major threat that has to be addressed globally, comprehensively by not only Israel's task, it's also not less the Western powers' task, and it has to be adhered and addressed in different capacities and different means, including, if needed, the military force, because the Iranian regime, who is very sophisticated and it's a marathon runner, responds to the threat of a military threat, and he knows to do the math. So I think that we have to understand it is not only Israel's task alone, it's the region's and the global task.
What would make up some of the components of this comprehensive action that you're speaking of in terms of responsibility on all different fronts with our allies?
The most significant thing is definitely the tangible threat of using excessive military force to restrain this regime. What happened during this year was that the Mullah regime is trying to save Hamas rule in Gaza Strip because Hamas is very significant for the Mullah regime for its own regional hegemonic vision. And once the Mullah regime has been intensifying its attacks through proxies on Israel, on the United States, and on the global trade, one of the things that happened was that the United States deployed a substantial military power in the region. The presence of this substantial military power in the region as for itself was enough by now to deter the Iranian regime for further significantly escalating its attack, because he knows to do the math. The Iranian regime is very vulnerable in many ways, and it knows that if it's going to sustain a significant blow, particularly militarily one, it may jeopardize its own endurance. So this is one example of one of the measures that has to be applied, if needed, in order to restrain this regime.
So tell us more about these vulnerabilities in the Iranian regime. What are you seeing there?
Well, we all know that there is a lot of unrest in Iran. We know that majority of the Iranian people are opposing this brutal regime. We saw what happened when people went out to the streets in Iran protesting. The regime was brutally killing them and arresting them and so on. There are lots of economic and social challenges in Iran. The Iranian president recently says that they need some $100 billion just to start rebuilding and establishing the crumbling infrastructure. The Iranian regime is very radical. It's very much detached of its own people. It's engaged in a very dangerous ideological imperialistic vision of making itself a global power. And that comes at the expense, among other things, of the Iranian people themselves. They know that they are constantly outcrying, they demanding to allocate the funds for their own well-being, but the mullah regime in Tehran has a different priorities.
Okay, now back in the U.S., former President Trump said last night that the U.S. election is the most important in Israel's history. How do you see the two candidates' platforms influencing the conflicts Israel's currently facing?
Well, we have experience with President Trump because he was a president, and during that term as a presidency, indeed, basically was making some moves that were clearly on Israel's side. You just mentioned it before, like, for example, moving the embassy to Jerusalem and recognizing Israel's rule over the Golan Heights and abolishing the Iranian-Israeli agreement and so on. As for Kamala Harris, it's kind of like an open question mark. There are different perspectives or different aspects regarding her positions and the influence or impact of her positions on the context of the situation in the Middle East. But I think that one way or another, I think the important thing is, in the end of the day, that regardless of the administration, any Western administration, not only in the United States, I think there is an enormous significant importance that the administration will comprehensively understand what's going on in the region and will understand the real powers and the real currents that actually shapes the reality of the Middle East. So the Western powers will have the ability to better address the challenges of the region, thus to secure their own long-term strategic interest. And the West has a lot of a long-term strategic interest in the Middle East.
Avi Melamed, great to speak with you. Thanks again.
Thank you for having me. Have a good day.